This Saturday, I had the privilege and honor of going skiing with my family. And if you know my family, my husband and kids are super into skiing and snowboarding. They have so much fun and they go quite often. I don't always join them. But this Saturday, yesterday, I made it all the way to the top. And here's a picture of the very tippy top of the White Pass mountain. So here's the deal, guys. I could show you this picture and celebrate it and say, this is amazing. And it was, but it's been a long time coming. It's taken me about 3 years to get up to the top of the mountain. You want to know why? Because to go all the way up means you also have to come down. You have to be able to ski well enough not to kill yourself coming down. And it's taken me a few years of really trying to learn how to ski, taking lessons, really going and increasing my own confidence and bravery, which doesn't always come naturally to me. And this Saturday, yesterday, I got to go up to that very top, and it was so gorgeous. It felt like spring skiing because it was 50 degrees up there. And it was sunny and not a single cloud in the sky. And I couldn't help but think, wow, this really is a mountaintop experience. Literally, a mountaintop experience, and how amazing it was. And yet it wouldn't have happened had I not really focused the last few years on trying to learn to ski well enough to get up to this point. I hope to continue to ski with my family because they love it. Today we're going to continue in the prophets. We're going to look at one of the major prophets, the longer prophet of Jeremiah today. And so I kind of want to just tell the story of Jeremiah, because in the book of Jeremiah, we get some of the narrative of his life. And I was thinking a lot about Jeremiah and reading through Jeremiah the last couple of weeks. And Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet, the prophet who wept over Israel because he loved his people so much. And yet it was a really challenging, difficult season in Israel's history. And this is the 6th century BC. God had Jeremiah prophesy to his people in Judah, in the southern kingdom. And like we've heard over and over and over in the prophets, the message was one of accusation of sin, calling out sin, calling the people to repentance, and then proclaiming that God's justice was coming. And so Jeremiah used very vivid language and metaphor to describe people's injustice and idolatry. In chapter 7, there's the temple sermon, which God has him go to the temple and tell everyone all the things that they have been doing wrong, how they've been acting unjustly, how they've been oppressing the foreigner and the fatherless and the widow, how they've been following Baal and worshiping other gods, how they've been stealing and murdering. And then coming to the temple and saying, oh, but here we're in the temple of God. In Jeremiah 7:10, part of Jeremiah's accusation, his temple sermon to the people, he says, and then you come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name. And this is God speaking, and say, we are safe. But we are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? God says, you've been doing all these detestable things and then coming into God's temple and saying, we're safe here because we're in the temple of God. And God is speaking through Jeremiah saying, it doesn't work that way. Following me doesn't work that way. Jeremiah, after that sermon, was arrested and forbidden to preach in the temple again. Over and over, Jeremiah calls the people to repentance. And in fact, in Jeremiah, God states explicitly, I want you to repent so we can avert this disaster that is coming. So we can avert the justice that is coming. There are two different types of justice, and we've talked about this multiple times through this series, and you have in Jeremiah these warnings of judgment. And the judgment is going to come in the form of military conquest by Babylon, which happens around 586 BC, and then the Israelites are going to be carried into exile for 70 years. But then there's also this restorative justice, this promise of hope and restoration. Here's what God speaks through Jeremiah in chapter 33, verse 6 through 9. Nevertheless, I will bring health and healing to it, speaking of Israel. I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity. I will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me and will forgive all their sin of rebellion against me. And then this city will bring me renown and joy and praise and honor before all the nations on earth that hear of all the good things I will do for it. And they will be in awe and will tremble at the abundant prosperity and peace I provide for it. So God is speaking through Jeremiah and says, judgment is coming, and also a promise for restoration. After about 20 years of prophesying, God tells Jeremiah to write down the message, write down the things that he's been speaking. And so he hires a scribe, Baruch, who compiles all his words or a summary of his words into a scroll. It includes sermons and poems. It includes letters and different bits of narrative. There is a whole lot of poetry, and so the metaphors are strong. It's kind of hard sometimes to read those sections of judgment. When Jeremiah couldn't go to the temple because he'd been forbidden to enter into the temple, and so he sends the scribe and he says, "Go read this out loud in presence of all the people at the temple." And so Baruch does, and then the king hears of it and says, "Come here." And so as he goes to the king and he rereads all the words that he spoke in the temple, the words that that God had given Jeremiah. And as he's reading, the king is literally cutting off parts of the scroll as he finishes reading them and throws them into the fire. It's like, no, these are words that we don't want to hear. And so after that, Baruch writes a second copy, and that's the copy that we have today. As we read through Jeremiah, we see that Jeremiah's prophecy is characterized by some pretty dramatic object lessons, which are really fun. I was a third grade teacher, and I love object lessons. And so, for instance, God has him take one of his belts and put it in the crevice of a rock outside in the weather and leave it there for 3 years. And then God says, "Go back and get that belt." And that belt, as you can imagine, is deteriorated and ruined and useless. And God says, that's an example of what this destruction that is coming is going to be like. God has Jeremiah go and visit the potter. And that's the famous verse that you might have heard, that I am the potter, God is the potter, and you are the clay. And these are words that Jeremiah is speaking as he's watching someone mold clay. There's another one that's really almost humorous because he's a little snarky at times too. But God has Jeremiah make this wooden yoke that you would put over animals. And there was this foreign committee, so like these representatives of different nations around Israel who'd come to speak to the king about forming an alliance to go against Babylon. And as they're leaving, Jeremiah goes to them and says, God is saying that you need to accept this yoke of Babylon, that you need to surrender to Babylon. And he goes to the foreign dignitaries before he goes to his own king. And then he goes to the king. And as you can imagine, it didn't go well. It wasn't well received. His message was not popular. He was beaten and he was accused of treason. He was imprisoned. At one point, he was thrown into a dry cistern. And it was a sad time because Jeremiah was present when Babylon came and when they captured Jerusalem. And they destroyed the city, including the temple. And many Israelites were taken captives. Many, especially the skilled workers, those who could contribute in specific ways to Babylon's society. But they took people captive to Babylon, and this was the great exile. And at one point, Jeremiah was actually began that journey with the exiles. He was actually captured and began the journey, and then he was found and released by the commander of the Babylonian Imperial Guard, who had heard of Jeremiah and was favorable to Jeremiah's message. And so he gave Jeremiah a choice. Do you want to come with us into exile? Do you want to stay in Judah? And Jeremiah chose to stay in Judah. Though later on, he was kidnapped by fellow Israelites who were rebelling against the Babylonian rule at that time. And so he was kidnapped and mistreated and all that and taken to Egypt by Israelites, where he likely died. It's so interesting hearing the bits of story as we read through the book of Jeremiah. And I'm really struck as I was thinking about this story and this part in history. I was struck by the messy middle, this liminal space. You know, when we decide, for instance, to run a marathon, between our decision to run the marathon and actually running the marathon, there's a whole lot of work that needs to be done, right? You can't run the marathon without the work. When my husband and I have a fight and we're angry with each other, I may want to skip right ahead to the resolution where all is well again between us. But I can't skip ahead until we've processed, right? What happened, what the other's thinking and feeling, that messy middle. When I hurt myself, I want to be well, but I can't just skip ahead to healing. It's a process of taking care of my body. In the story of Israel, Jeremiah has told the Israelites, you will be in Babylon for 70 years for this exile. For some, it's their entire lives or the rest of their lives. This is a long, messy middle that is coming. And there was a promised restoration, that God would bring about healing and wholeness and restoration for peace and security and forgiveness, and all would be right between Israel and God again. But first, there was the 70 years of exile. And so how did Israel respond? How would they respond in this messy middle? And that's where I want to really hone in on the story. How would they live as they were in Babylon? There were false prophets in Babylon with Israel who were prophesying that, don't worry, we're going to return home very soon. And the Israelites were hearing this and they were asking this questions, what do we do now in the messy middle? And this is the section I really want to hone in on. It's in Jeremiah 29. And Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles. And we'll just read the first part of the letter. And it describes how to live in this messy middle, starting in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Jeremiah starts off by saying, and this is God speaking to Jeremiah, build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce. And we see here that the exiles in Babylon had a lot of freedom as well. I'm sure there were many who lived as slaves and did not have freedom, but there were many who were allowed to move about and live semi-normal lives. And yet they were in limbo. What do we do in this space, in this middle? And Jeremiah, God says through Jeremiah, settle down. Build houses and plant gardens. Those things take a long time to do, right? Steve was up here talking about the community garden. They've already planted. We won't be harvesting that for months. And that takes time. Really what Jeremiah is saying is become a part of that community. Grow roots in that community. Pray to the Lord for it. And remember, these are the people who came and captured them. These are the people that they consider their enemies. And God is saying, be in community with them and pray to the Lord. Seek the peace and prosperity of that community. I can imagine their pushback, their natural reaction. I don't want to do that. I want to go home, God. Right now. And yet this is their invitation. God says there is hope and there's restoration. But for now, be a part of that community and do good for that community. You know, this really reminds me of the words of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. That is such a powerful thing. In my journey, I wouldn't necessarily say I've had enemies, but I've had people that I really struggled with. You know, people who have hurt me, people who I didn't get along with, who frustrated me. And I've attempted to practice this. Like, okay, Jesus says to love your enemy, pray for those who persecute you. I'm going to do that. And I've noticed in myself, my prayers start off with quite a bit of anger and bitterness. Lord, just open their eyes that they might see what they've done. Help them know that they've done wrong. You know, like those kinds of prayers. And through the Spirit's work in my heart, as I continue praying for those people, I've experienced a change from anger and bitterness to a place where in my heart I truly desire what's best for that person. A softening of that I can pray prayers like, may they experience your love and your nearness, God. And I know God's really doing a work in me when my prayers change yet again, and it's not so much praying for them, but praying for us. Lord, may we both experience your healing. May we both experience your nearness when I can put myself in the same boat as that other person. And so Jeremiah says to the people, pray for those who live around you. Seek their prosperity and peace of the city. Jeremiah also says, don't believe the lies. In verse 8, don't believe the lies that they tell you. They're prophesying lies in my name, and I have not sent them. You know, there will always be people who tell us what we want to hear. And in a world of technology and the internet, that is even more true than it has been before. There are so many voices that we can listen to. I had a conversation with one of my daughters in the car, and she mentioned, it's a fact that, blah, 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 and she told me something. And I'm thinking, where'd you hear that fact? And it came from a YouTube short. And so then we had a great conversation about, not everything you hear or see is true. So how do we filter those voices? How do we determine what is actually credible, what is of God, and what is not? And Jeremiah warns the Israelites, do not listen to the false prophets. It reminds Israel of God's plans for hope and a future. And this is a beautiful verse. Many of us have heard it in verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. It's written on a whole lot of pieces of art, probably hanging in some of our houses. And it is a great verse to hold onto. It describes the heart of God, that God is about bringing about good in our lives and in this world. We serve and worship a God of healing and wholeness, a God of joy and hope. And to all that, I say amen. And also, God has given humanity free will. And humanity has chosen to sin. And there is a whole lot of destruction and pain and suffering in this world. And both those things are true at the same time. So often that verse is misused to say something to the effect, along the lines that then we will never suffer, or there will never be challenges. And that's, just the context here. The context that verse was spoken was the context of exile. The Israelites were in exile for 70 years. There is so much of what happens in the world that is not what God wants. Evil and pain and sin is not what God desires. And yet in the midst of that pain, in the midst of that suffering and challenge, God promises to work for good. God promises to bring about hope and a future. And so this is a very beautiful promise in Jeremiah 29:11. Given at the very beginning of a 70-year exile. And then the last thing that we read in this section, Jeremiah encourages the Israelites to seek God and to find God. And to seek God with all their hearts, and they will find God. Here's an amazing thing about God. God wants to be found. God has invited us. God is attentive. God is listening. God is waiting. God wants to be found. The words of Jesus in Matthew 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. Even this horrendous journey of exile, God can use to lead his people back to God. So as I think about application for this scripture, I'm reminded that as we read the prophets, there's not a one-to-one correlation, right? For us here today, that we live in a different time, we're in a different part of the narrative, and yet there's some very valuable truths and a relevant message for us today. Many of us are living in some sort of messy middle. Some sort of messy middle. We live in a world in some ways a lot like both ancient Israel and ancient Babylon. A world in which the vulnerable in societies are not well looked after. A world in which some of those with power and privilege and resource take advantage of those who have less, or simply ignore those who have less. We live in a world where injustice and idolatry are prominent. It's just the norm. Systems that are broken. And as Jesus followers, in another sense, our life is, we also live in the messy middle. We live in an inaugurated kingdom where God has promised to make everything new. We sang about it today, right? God has promised to make everything new, and yet it hasn't all been made new yet. It's a process, and it's still in process. Jesus has overcome evil and death and sin and offers a pathway to healing and wholeness and salvation and a whole new way of living. And as Jesus followers, we're in this process of being transformed to reflect the perfect and loving image of the Trinity. And yet, even in ourselves, if we're honest, it's pretty obvious that transformation isn't complete. For me, it's real obvious, okay? That transformation isn't complete yet. Jesus in John 16, verse 3 says this, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. We will have trouble, but we know how the story ends. God will make everything new. So I wonder for us here today, what are we in the middle of right now? Maybe you're on a journey of grief and it's a really heavy season. Maybe it's a physical ailment or illness, a mental health battle. It's real hard. Maybe you're processing traumatic events that have happened in your life. Or you're in the middle of a fight for justice. In some area of your life, injustice has just reared its ugly head, and you are just really fighting hard. Maybe you come today exhausted. Maybe there's a relationship that's falling apart. Well, the good news is that the Trinity is present with us in the middle. That God does not leave us to walk these journeys alone. Yes, there is a messy middle, and God invites us to journey with the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I think in a lot of ways we're invited to the same things the exiles were invited to settle in and to grow roots, to become a part of a community, not to be isolated, but rather to walk with people. And that can be a church community, yes, to that, and also a larger community, a community outside the church, to seek the peace and prosperity of the community we live in at large, to work for good. And what if we were known, those Jesus people? They're always working for good. Wouldn't that be awesome? To pray and to love our enemies. And enemy is a really strong word, language there. So maybe think of it to pray and to love for people whom we don't really associate with or want to associate with. That our hearts would be tender with compassion. We're invited not to listen to the lies. So many voices telling us what to do, who to be, how to live, but to learn to distinguish the voice of God from all the other voices, and to seek and find God with all our hearts. May we be present to God as God is always present to us. Friends, God has beautiful plans for our lives and our community and for our world. We're living right now in a messy middle. That doesn't change the fact that God is doing amazing things. and that his promise will come true. There will be peace and healing. There will be wholeness and salvation. May we remember and trust that God is always working his plan to make everything new. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you. We just say thank you. Because life can be really hard. And I can't hardly imagine what it would be like without you. Thank you for being present to us when we're walking through really challenging things. And Lord, I pray that you would teach us as a people to look to you in the messy middle and to hold on to your promises of hope and healing and salvation, and that you would teach us and empower us and strengthen us to walk in your ways on the mountaintop and also in the messy middle. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.